So we have two sessions in this lecture series on memory and forgetting. And from the perspective of Ottoman studies, of course, the elephant in the room talking about memory and especially forgetting may be the genocide of the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire, Armenians and Arameans, Assyrians, during the First World War. So, since the topic of this lecture, this year's lecture, is memory and forgetting, I should focus on that example. Yet, the two sessions we have, they should have been organized as the first session as of today, presenting the discipline, the academic discipline. And I will focus on that. And our next session in January, I will talk more of the example of the historiography, maybe, and the sources for the topic of the Armenian genocide more. But of course, it's difficult to talk about how a scientific discipline deals with the topic if we don't know anything about the topic itself. So today I have to include quite a few remarks on the topic itself, namely the genocide. So this is also a trigger warning. Today's topic is not very pleasant and right to the contrary. And, but it is an integral part of Ottoman studies and Turkology. One cannot really imagine doing Ottoman studies and not imagine doing specializing on the late Ottoman Empire without talking about the Armenian genocide. Yet, and this is how I plunge directly into my topic, this is what Ottoman studies has done for decades. So we have a tradition of Ottoman studies and Turkology, a tradition which took the path of denying or not talking at all about the genocide of the Armenians, and it's only in recent years that this tradition changed fundamentally. And it changed because something changed in Turkey. So we have different layers which we have to talk about. We have to talk about what is Ottoman studies and Turkology in general as a scientific discipline, what it is in Germany, what is the tradition in the German-speaking countries and beyond in Europe or the Western world, what it could be in Turkey, and how a scientific discipline, as any scientific discipline, is also embedded and influenced by the political, social, cultural surroundings, by context. So Turkology, it starts with the name. Turkology, Turkish studies, Ottoman studies. As you may know, this institute in Berlin recently changed its name. It's only 2 years that we changed the name of the institute. It used to be an institute for Turkology. And when I came, I decided to rename the institute and call it Institute for Ottoman Studies and Turkology, and we'll soon see why that was necessary, or I found it necessary. What does it mean, Turkology? Turkology, like all these disciplines that call themselves something with ology, it's about reading and understanding texts in the best sense of classical philology, like learning a language and reading and interpreting texts, and in our case, when we have written documents in different alphabets than the Latin, it also means transcribing texts. So that was for a long time, and then it was for a long time on editing texts, and that was a very necessary thing to do, because the many sources, many textual monuments were not accessible or difficult accessible, and they had to be. It needs a lot of expertise to read and to understand these texts. it needs a lot of contextualization. It needs a lot of, for the case of the Ottoman and Turkish, all Turkish language texts that we have, usually written in Arabic script. And also the Ottoman language poses many challenges, since it includes, as you know, a great deal of Persian and Arabic. Not only the vocabulary, but also the grammar. It includes a lot of traditions, intellectual traditions, which we also have to be aware of when interpreting and reading the texts. We have to know what are the writing traditions of the time, and then, of course, also the sources have to be made accessible. So if we study manuscripts, Ottoman manuscripts of, let's say, the 17th century, it took quite a while until, you know, we get to know which manuscript is where, and we are still not finished with this kind of work yet, because when every now and then a new manuscript pops up in some European or American library or in some Turkish library, so we are still far away from having our basic material made accessible. Whereas for comparison, in European historiography, or let's take the German example, that these kind of operations, editing texts, finding the manuscripts, preparing critical editions, like comparing all the manuscripts and then comparing how they differ and who added which kind of additional hand added or copied something and what in which kind of context, all of this, or many of these, were done 200 or 250 years ago. And in Ottoman studies, we are still there. It's not about, you know, being not modern enough. It is just, you know, this is our state, our present day condition. So it is still very reasonable that we talk of our discipline as Turkology, as a philology, and do philological basic work. Part of this work is also creating the tools which allow us to deal with Ottoman sources. And I focus, as you see, on the Ottoman part, because Turkology as a discipline is, of course, much, much broader. It encompasses the entire Turkic-speaking world, which stretches from the Balkans, from Bulgaria to the west of China, as you know, and has dozens of different languages and dialects, and of course also a quite long period of time. So we have a great variety of Turkic languages, dialects, geographically widely spread and also spread in time. So this is also, there is a lot of research to be done, but let me focus back only on the Ottoman to understand and to have these texts and to be able to deal with Ottoman sources. It needs a great expertise, and and also the tools that help us. A basic tool would be a dictionary. As Ottomanists, and many of you know, we are still working with a dictionary that was initially prepared by a missionary in the late 19th century, namely James Redhouse, and we are still using James Redhouse as the basic reference and as the most important dictionary for Ottoman texts. We could name others, but they are not younger. We could name Şemseddin Sami, who was an Ottoman intellectual and prepared a dictionary, Kamusi Türki, and we still use it. So our tools are far away from being, you know, being complete or being really handy. So there is, again, here still a lot to do. For historians, we could name another topic of historiography, or as a historiographical tool, as both a historiographical tool and a topic of research. That is what the Germans name Begriffsgeschichte, and what is in English-speaking countries translated as conceptual history or history of concepts. This could be doing, like, thematizing the concepts, the words we use to describe things or phenomena, and to trace them through history and usage. because concepts obviously change their meanings through time and according to situations, to the contexts. So if we take something like a term like family, what does it mean? Do we understand the nuclear family of mother, father, and a child or several children? Or do we include the extended family, all the relatives? Do we also include the servants of a household? Or would that be something different? Who is named a relative? Who is named a part of, and what does a household mean? So all of these are concepts that change their meanings in time and also space. And of course, needless to say, for Ottoman studies, we are again at the beginning. And we can still continue. What does it mean to say a nation? And then, of course, all these words, we have an additional problem here because as I doing now, I'm speaking in English, but I'm talking about the Ottoman Empire, where the language of the sources is a completely different one, and it creates a problem which should be thematized if I simply translate. Because, let me exemplify this with the term of nation. How does it translate into Ottoman? Or what does it, or which Ottoman term do I translate as nation? Is that millet? And hasn't millet a completely different meaning in the Ottoman context? And not necessarily mean the same as nation when I use it in English or in German or in any other European language? What do I do with terminology as timar or sipahi? So we end up translating, but translating, the translations carry in them all the notions that a term has in a different context. In our case, in the English context, or American context, or European context, in contrast to what could be an Ottoman understanding. And then we still have the timeline that the term millet may have changed its meaning, or the term askari, or the term riaya may change their meaning throughout Ottoman history. So what we need is research on that, and what we also need is a great lexicon on that. That could be a useful, helpful tool to understand what we are talking about. So I see a comment, nation means ulus. Yes, of course. But that's one possible usage. And where does the term ulus come from? So all these, I'm not focusing on specific examples, and I'm not lecturing on the term ulus or millet or sipahi or askari. What I wanted to stress is the necessity to create our tools, and this requires research, and we still have a long path in front of us. Please, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, it's going to be about the Ottomans necessarily used all the ulus back then. I think it's quite
exactly. Maybe they didn't use it, and this is what I meant, requiring research. Which term was used by whom, in which kind of context, with which meaning? And this is what I mean when I say, okay, we still have to create our tools. So then, and this is why Turkology as philology has still its place. But yet, what we are doing, of course, for quite a long time, is to interpret under the same framework of Turkology and in extremely small institutes. Outside Turkey, of course. In Turkey, you have institutes for history, and then it's clear you are doing history, and a great part of that history would be Ottoman history or the history of the Seljuks, and then if we come to the 20th century, it would be the history of the Turkish Republic. But it's all history. You will have other institutes for politology or sociology or what have you, and they will all turn on Turkey and the geography of today's Turkey, with all its history, from the most ancient times until through the Seljuks and through the Ottomans and through the all the other principalities that existed there, and then come to finally end up dealing with the Turkish Republic of today. You will have institutes for literature. Again, you will deal with Turkish, Old Turkish, and then Ottoman and modern Turkish literature. You will have institutes of linguistics, and you will deal with Turkish linguistics. But outside Turkey, you have tiny small institutes, as ours is here, consisting of one professor and one assistant and a student assistant and a part-time secretary and a language instructor. And then what can you do? Do you serve the entire field of whatever concerns the geography of Turkey? This was the interpretation. It sounds absurd, but it very seriously was and is until today the interpretation of Turkology, and in German, whoever, I don't know who knows German, it is very often called that the professor has to serve the topic in its full width, das Fach in seiner gesamten Breite, which means you have to be a historian of all periods of time, you have to be knowledgeable of at least a couple of the Turkic languages, you have to be knowledgeable of the literature, of the linguistics, and so on and so forth. And of course also be familiar with the context, because without having a profound knowledge of Islamic tradition, it's very hard to study Ottoman history, because of course the legal system was an Islamic legal system. Of course, Ottoman intellectual history is profoundly rooted in Islamic tradition. You also have to know, since all the Ottoman learned were, of course, trilingual at least, mastering what they called the El-Sine-i Selase, which means the three languages of learning, and these were Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. Of course, as a good Ottomanist and as a good Turkologist, you should have learned all these languages as well. And of course, you have to learn all the languages, the important languages of the secondary literature, and as a great deal of the secondary literature on Central Asia was produced during the Russian and Soviet period, so it's in Russian, obviously you have to learn Russian as well, and not to talk about English and French, and if you are a German, you already know German. So you see what happens. The reaction is very understandable, yet that was our very serious reality, or is until today. And what happens in practice? Nobody is a specialist for things in general, and nobody is able to master all these languages and all these knowledge fields. So obviously everybody has a specialization. And what we experience now, and what I tried to really change at my institute, is what I would call a professionalization of Turkology. Namely, name the specialization. I'm a historian by training, which means I'm not familiar with, or not profoundly familiar with, Uzbek literature or the linguistics of Old Turkic or Old Uyghur, which I don't know at all. But I am familiar with the recent discourses and theoretical and methodological debates in historiography in general, and of course I am familiar with Ottoman history, and I specialize in a certain period of Ottoman history, namely the late Ottoman history. So here I have the proficiency to read the sources. I have the proficiency to know quite a bit about the context, to have studied Islamic traditions as well, to understand how the Ottomans perceive themselves, Ottoman statements, Ottoman intellectuals perceive themselves. I have a knowledge of more than one Ottoman language, because that would be a requirement taking the Ottoman Empire serious. You should know not only the El-Sine-i Selase, but also at least consider that the Ottoman Empire was a multilingual empire with a bulk of sources in non-Turkish and not Islamic languages. The Islamic would be, of course, Arabic I already named, but also Albanian, Bosnian, but then you have also Bulgarian, you have Greek, you have Armenian, you have, a lot of, you have Spanish for the sources of the Jewish community, and all these languages are important to understand Ottoman history. Of course, again, nobody is able to know all of them, but at least you should have a sense of it. That's already enough. So, to professionalize means to name, okay, this institute has a certain profile, and this profile could be historical, it could be specializing on literature, and my colleague Peter Kuchera, who is a professor of Turkish language literature at the University of Mainz, talks completely differently about Turkish and Ottoman literature that I would ever do. But on the contrary, I am raising different questions and dealing differently with Ottoman historiography than a specialist on Turkish and Ottoman linguistics could do. So this is a recent development that we acknowledge that we have to specialize. We have to specialize so that we narrow down our focus on one still broad enough field of specialization, in our case here, Ottoman studies. And in the same time, by specializing, by specialization and by professionalizing Ottoman studies, we open up our focus because we want to have the interdisciplinary exchange with other fields of historiography, with other fields of history, with other regions of history. So what are we doing is entangled history, trans-Ottoman history. We consider the debates for other regions. We include the debates that are led in historiography as such, like the most prominent example may be post-colonial studies or subaltern studies, a bunch of debates that started studying colonial India, which of course is not my field. But, however, we use all these theoretical and methodological frameworks. Microhistory could be another, focusing on autobiographical narratives could be yet another, and I could name quite a few. We use all these frameworks methodologically and theoretical frameworks to get something out for our understanding of Ottoman history, and vice versa, to contribute to the global debates on historiography with our Ottoman example. So, Turkology, as it was quite isolated from broader or transdisciplinary academic discourses, would, tend, as all the other philologies in small institutes, to invent the wheel from scratch because of unfamiliarity and not being connected to intellectual discourses beyond the own philology. And this has changed. Now, more and more, there is an interdisciplinary exchange, and the research profiles and the scope of research projects are more and more interdisciplinary, and now we already have courses of study which are called interdisciplinary studies of the Middle East. So you are experiencing exactly that. What does it mean, interdisciplinarity? And when you learn Arabic studies and they deal with literature, and we learn Islamic studies and they focus maybe on religion or history of ideas or sociology, then you have exactly that interdisciplinarity that is required now. So it is getting discourses from other disciplines and from other fields of study, from other regional fields of study, and contributing to those broader and interdisciplinary discourses. So Ottoman studies has crossed this path, yet there is also another layer that we have to look at in figuring out what is our discipline, Ottoman studies, or how could it be defined. That is, each scientific discipline in each country or each society is also affected by its contexts. And the contexts are the non-scientific context. It's shaped by its own tradition. As I said, for Germany, especially for Germany, the tradition is much philological, and only in recent years we have turned a little bit away from this philological tradition. And now we have to be very, very careful not to pour the child out with the bath and not to lose the philological skills we were trained so much. So we should be very careful that in our attempt to modernize our discipline, we don't lose what we had with our own tradition. Still, focusing and still be able, to deal with Ottoman philology, being Ottoman paleography, and so we still need to cultivate that, but professionalize, focus, and enter into interdisciplinary discussions, as I mentioned. So this is the scientific tradition. Then, of course, is the cultural, social, and political contexts. And here in Ottoman studies, not only in Ottoman studies, but I will talk about Ottoman studies, we have a variety of factors. One factor, a very important one, is more general and affects maybe history and historiography, even of Europe or every society, any society. That is the change of world order from an imperial structure to an assembly of nation states. That is the rise of ethno-nationalism. And of course, the nation-building processes throughout the 19th century, and then the establishing of a world consisting of nation states, or mainly of nation states, or of states that would be called nation states, has affected historiography as well. It did not only affect history, but also historiography. Because, as you know, the very common sentence, every generation writes its own history, this is what we do. Historians or scientists in general, they ask the questions that are relevant to them in their present time. So what do we examine? What do we ask? What do we look at? With which parameters do we look at things, including history? Very much depends on what is our situation today as researchers, as a society, as a body politic. And of course, the rise of nation states created a national historiography, created a historiography all over that focused on the nation as the entity in question. And this also affected how we looked at Ottoman history. So Ottoman history very much became, in this national nation-state framework, even Ottoman history. We are, all of us, and all of the historians of decades ago, all of them were aware that the Ottoman Empire, of course, was not present-day Turkey, but was much broader and was a huge empire and was a multilinguistic and multi-religious and multi-ethnic empire. Yet, the way it was described resembled very much writing a history of Turkey. Not only for Turkish historiography of the Ottoman Empire, also for the historiography of the Ottoman Empire, which was done in the former Ottoman provinces, the Balkan states, the Arabic states. So they developed their own national historiography, where the long centuries of being part of the Ottoman Empire was in the extreme reduced to, the dark centuries of the so-called Turkish yoke, and then nationalist historiography in all these successor states would rather focus on the pre-Ottoman history, then jump over the Ottoman centuries very quickly, and then to reach the national awakening, as it is called in many of these societies, and almost all of these societies, the national awakening, and then the formation of a modern nation state. So the Ottoman history and the Ottoman contexts of own history were diminished or were, labeled as dark centuries of foreign rule, of Turkish oppression, of the so-called Turkish yoke. That's a very common trope in almost all non-Turkish post-Ottoman successor states, and it took all of these historiographical traditions decades to develop something like Ottoman studies in their own country, which means to acknowledge that many centuries of their history were part of Ottoman history, or put it vice versa, that many centuries of their own history have taken place in an Ottoman context. So what had to develop was Ottoman studies. Ottoman studies that would look at, let's say, Bulgarian or Greek or Syrian history as Ottoman, and to place the own society within this Ottoman context. And this, it may sound so logical, but we are quite at the beginning. It's a matter of the last 10 or 20 years that we have started to look at Ottoman history in this kind of framework. To say, okay, not to jump over the centuries of Ottoman rule in the post-Ottoman societies, but to look at them, and to look at them as part of the own history, which opens up new questions. Let's take the example of, let's say, Greek or Bulgarian. So that opens up, how did Bulgarian peasants, or even more important for the beginnings of this kind of historiography, the elites, because there we have no more sources, and they were maybe more interconnected, interwoven with the Ottoman state. How did they act as Ottomans? Can we describe them as Ottomans? Of course we can, because they were acting within the Ottoman framework. And that, of course, you see that this kind of interpretation, to interpret the own elites, to first of all remember the own elites of the Ottoman times who acted as Ottomans, and then to interpret them as Ottomans and, let's say, Greeks, Bulgarians, Arabs, Armenians, whatever, Albanians alike, that runs contrary to nationalist ideology, that runs contrary to national history. For Turkey, there is, of course, there can't be a denial of the Ottoman past. Of course, with the foundation of the Turkish Republic, there was a tremendous political effort to set up something like an hour zero, or a point of zero, a point of new departure, with all the modernizing reforms of the Kemalist regime, way after the founding father Mustafa Kemal himself. But in the very early years of the Republic, we see all these reforms to get rid of the Arabic script and start something new with Latin script, and also to get rid of the old language, of the Ottoman language, which was a marker of Ottoman identity, of a joint Ottoman identity, encompassing the entire empire and so many traditions, the Byzantine, the Persian, the Arab. So there was a political effort to push something like a reset button and say, we start anew as Turks. And we Turkify everything, the language, the habits, and this Turkification means also Europeanization.
Just a remark. So it just looks then that nobody wants to do anything with the Ottoman Empire.
That was indeed the case. That was indeed the case.
Not
like
in Turkey, not the
of course
British,
in
the Bulgarian,
of course in many of the, in almost all of the non-Turkish successor state, as I said, the Ottoman history was very much, marginalized, because nationalist ideology and nation-state historiography doesn't have a use for that, doesn't have a use for Ottoman history. What for? But in Turkey, of course, the matter is more complicated. There was this, and this is what I now wanted to say. There was this political effort to create something like a 0 point. We start anew as Turkey. And we don't have very much in common with this old, rotten, ancien regime Ottoman state. However, what was there? The ruling family was a Turkish dynasty. At least it was defined as such. Of course, from a genetical, I'm not talking about the genetical pool, but I'm talking about the self-ascription, the self. Yeah. Of course, it was a Turkish dynasty, the House of Osman. And of course, it was a Turkish empire. And of course, it was Ottoman Turkish is Turkish at the end of the day. So, in the same time, there were the glorious days of the Ottoman Empire, and then there is an interesting terminology. There is a confusion of what we name Ottoman and what we name Turkish. You see that in studying many of the historiographical work, to say the Turkish Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent, but the Ottoman Sultan Abdülhamid II. So, to claim the splendor of the Ottoman Empire, but to diminish, or to distance oneself as much as possible from the declining, the weak, the autocratic Ottoman Empire, against which the generation of the so-called young Turks made a revolution, made a coup d'etat, and then distanced themselves and got rid of the old Sultan, of the old regime. And then the Kemalist regime was somehow, in many respects, a prolongation of the young Turkish era. And this led, by the way, in parentheses, an important Ottoman historian, Erik Jan Türcher, to modify the periodization of recent Ottoman history and to say, okay, we had the Tanzimat period, or like the 19th century, and then comes the young Turkish period of Ottoman history, and he starts that young Turkish period of Ottoman and Turkish history in 1908 with the Young Turkish Revolution, and he continues it until 1950 and takes that as a period. So Turkey has a different relationship, and Turkish national historiography has a different relationship with the Ottoman past, claiming at least parts of it and distancing oneself from other parts of it, but not distancing oneself from the entire Ottoman heritage or from Ottoman rules, because it was the Turks themselves, of course in quotation marks, that ruled the Ottoman Empire. So the only group in the Ottoman Empire that did not have the intellectual option to distance itself entirely from the Ottoman Empire were the Turks. All other nationalities could create an understanding of their own nation in contrast to the Ottoman Empire. The Arabs, all the Balkan populations, all the non-Turkish populations and non-Muslim populations of Anatolia, and the Turks not. However, there was included, nationalist historiography does not only mean on this very, on the forefront, framing the nation as the entity I want to speak about, distancing or oneself from the Ottoman Empire, from Ottoman heritage, or at least parts of it. But it also means what kind of categories do we use in describing Ottoman history? What do we remember and what do we forget? And what kind of questions do we ask? And this goes much deeper, and we may not really realize what we are doing and what we are asking, and whether this is still, informed by nationalism or national ideology, or the ideology of the nation state as such, and not a specific nation state. For instance, there is a whole study or corpus of study on, not really profound study, but there is a notion of when the Tanzimat reform began, one important part of it was the military reform. And there is a notion that until the 19th century, military service was a burden mostly put on the shoulders of the Anatolian peasant, which means then, translated into Turkish more popular perception of the history, the Turks carried the burden of defending the Ottoman Empire, and all others betrayed it. The Turks shed their blood for the Ottoman Empire, and all others betrayed it. Yes?
I'm sorry, I'm confused by a couple of terms. Like, what does a Turk or Turkish even mean?
Exactly.
That doesn't mean anything to me, because I mean there were a lot of like other. I mean, is it defined by language? Is it like Turkish speaking, or like Turkish speaking peasants in the Anatolia? Because there were like hundreds of other languages in Anatolia at the time that were like diminished after the Republic and everything. So it's just very confusing to me, especially when we're talking about before like pre-nationalist era of the
Exactly.
world.
And this confusion, yes?
I can say something about my own background to Turk question. I don't think it's defined by the language because, for example, my dad's grandmother's native language was Greek, and she was born and raised in one of the Greece islands called Mytilene. But since she was Muslim who lived back in there, she forced to migrate to Turkey when it's established. So I think maybe it could be depending on religion and like.
Yeah,
but I know like it's not a delicate topic, not a certain kind of.
A very similar case is actually again about the population exchange and at the end of the Ottoman Empire is there used to be a very, very much Turkic population, but Christian in Karaman, but they were also sent to Greece, and Muslim Greeks were brought to Turkey, and this was not necessarily about language or ethnicity or genetics or whatever, but probably about confessionalism. I don't know.
Exactly. So you put your finger exactly to the point. That would have been my next point. What does it mean, Turkish? So if there is a notion, the Turks spilled their blood, the Turks, that is a notion of, entertained somehow by historiography in a national and nationalist framework, as if the notion of Turk was so clear that it is today, and not even today it is so clear, but it is pretended as if the notion was clear. So until today, we can debate what do we understand by naming somebody a Turk. Of course, in Turkey and in Turkish language, there is a way of differentiating between Türk and Türkiyeli. So Türk would be the ethnic and possibly Turkish-speaking and Sunni Muslim, and here the debate again starts. Do we include the non-Sunni Muslim Turks as Turks? Or do we somehow exclude them from the nation or from the good nation? What do we do with the non-Muslims at all? So here is the differentiation between Turk as defined at least as an ethnic category, maybe with the Turk-Islam synthesis as also an ethno-religious category, maybe connected to a linguistic category, and differentiating the Türkiyeli, those who belong to the geography of present-day Turkey, but may be Kurds or Armenians or Arabs or...
Jewish people, for example, in Turkey, the Jewish people have a community and they call themselves Türk Yahudi Toplumu, which means Turkish Jewish community.
Yes. So here it's interesting. But if you translate that to European languages and to European language historiography on the Ottoman Empire or on Turkey, it becomes tremendously complicated. Who is named a Turk? And even in Ottoman times, exactly that, throughout the 19th century, during the epoch, during the era of nation-building processes, who is by definition accepted or rejected, included or excluded to a specific nation, was hotly debated. So, for the Ottoman times, or in ancient Ottoman times, there was another separation and another usage of the term Turk, and many of you may be familiar with that. Turk was used in contrast to Osmanlı, and Osmanlı was the elite, distinguished by the Osmanlı language, by Ottoman language, which was a high literature language used also for the administration of the country, but somehow, and many people call it an artificial language, at least a language, a very elaborate intellectual language, in contrast to the language of the ordinary people, to the spoken language of the ordinary people, that was not Osmanlıca, but Türkçe. And so Türk would be the ordinary people, the peasants, in contrast to the educated elite. So Türk was also used as a term of disrespect in some cases. And it's only under, nationalists reframing of the word that became a term of pride. And the Osmanlı has been dismissed as, old-fashioned, not modern, not, sick, the sick man of the Bosphorus, and so. Here also, European Orientalism is a factor to consider in the usage. So for the Europeans, of course, they knew that the ruling dynasty was called the House of Osman. But for them, the empire was just Turkey. Turkey in Europe, Turkey in Asia. And it was the Turkish emperor was the Ottoman Sultan. That could be, so here again, we come back to the topic of different usage and reframing of terms, history of concepts. So who was a Turk? But that was not only true for the Turks, but also for other nationalities. All the inner Balkan struggles or the Balkan wars were fought about who belongs to which entity. Whom do we claim to which entity? What do we do of, I saw your hand, but just let me finish that sentence. Who do we attribute? What do we do with Muslims in Bulgaria speaking Bulgarian? Do they have the right religion but the wrong language and should only learn the better language? Or do they have the right language but the wrong religion and they should rather convert? So, in the first years of the 20th century, when the Balkan provinces were still, some of the Balkan provinces were still Ottoman, there was a battle of opening schools and founding, educating the people to push them and to pull them to one side or the other, to claim segments of population. That was the inclusive part of it. And the exclusive part of it, we also witness in late Ottoman and also early Republican, then Turkish history, to exclude certain portions of the population from the notion of Turkishness, or to include them even forcefully, for instance, by defining the Kurdish population as mountain Turks. Defining, okay, these are Sunni Muslims, in their majority at least, and declaring that Kurdish, the Kurdish languages or the Kurdish dialects, which are Iranian languages or belong linguistically to that language family, just to declare, okay, these are barbaric mountain dialects, and once they learn proper Turkish, they can be good Turks. And we define them as mountain Turks, which is to denounce their specificity is not having another ethnicity or language or tradition, but being, quote unquote, barbaric and, not underdeveloped. Please.
I raised my hand when you mentioned the Balkans, because I think also good basic reading for this is still Benedict Anderson, who talks about imagined communities on the example of the Balkan Wars.
That is, yes, Benedict Anderson, Imagined Communities is the basic reading for for almost everything we are discussing, not only for the Balkans, but for understanding how a modern notion of nation came about. And he has also, and that also is on my list to mention, and this is amazing. I never gave a lecture like that. Whenever everybody raising its hand just hints to the next point that I want to talk. So thank you for that. Of course, Benedict Anderson, he hints to the birth and the development of nation as an entity. Nation, not necessarily states, but before the state comes into existence, there develops a sense of belonging and tied to a certain geography. So there are two factors he names. One is a sense of geography, including borders. And you can see this is valid to the present day. Now, our present day example, of course, is Israel-Palestine. And you see that many Palestinians wear like miniature maps of Palestine to identify. You can see a similar thing with, let's say, yes, but also from just the silhouettes of the Palestinian geography. And this is what I mean, a silhouette of geography. You immediately identify with, a national belonging. You can see that also in the case of Armenia, and then with different geographies. You can see the same in the case of Hungary, let's say. What is identified as a Hungarian geography, you can see the same thing. Of course, in the case of Germany, what was to be identified as German and Germany. And even in the German national anthem, the now forbidden first part of it describes a geography. Of course, that's a geography which is now and always was beyond the borders of a German nation state, and this is exactly for this expansive, description of an imagined German geography, which extends from one river to a certain other river, and marks a Germany that would be, so this is marking a geography, painting a geography, identifying with a geography which cannot be experienced in person, but can be imagined as a geography. And then, of course, schooling, language, and the spread of language plays an important role, and the establishing of one standard language, the standardization of language as a tool to connect different regions of this imagined entity together. And there, Benedict Anderson has a still valid and very important point to mention or to name this: print capitalism. The combination of printing press and capitalism to distribute, and then of course the boom of newspapers in a standardized language that were sold and read throughout the imagined entity, and connected and tied the imagined nation together. And so we have nation building processes in all cases, and also in the Ottoman case, start as language reform processes. So political or language reform is connected, closely connected to political reform and nation. Nowadays, we may perceive nation or nationalism as a quite reactionary, in some cases, notion, and we, at least in part, we may opt for post-nationalist, modern, more human, and so on societies. But back then, nationalism meant also the struggle for political participation, a struggle for democracy. So the nationalist leaders were the revolutionaries who opposed imperial autocracy and demanded political rights, political participation, and education for broader segments of the population, establishing schools, making everything, simplifying the language, making language and learning accessible to a broader range of people. So all of these things were associated with the notion of nation. So also in the Ottoman Empire, all the nation-building movements started with language reform project, educational project, claims for political participation, revolutionary movements opposed to imperial autocracy. And now we come to the memories and forgetting of historiography. The national historiographies, of course, tend to remember and highlight the predecessors of their own nationalisms and national movements. So all these language reformists, all these revolutionaries, they are the national heroes of the post-Ottoman societies. And the more traditional, majoritarian, Ottomanists, Ottomans, Ottoman elites, they are the ones going to oblivion and not remembered in nationalist historiography. I give you one example. Quite a lot of years ago, a group of Ottoman historians, we were a group of Ottoman historians, and we thought, okay, if we try to take serious the Ottoman Empire as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual empire, and we also consider that many of these Ottoman languages, but not Muslim and not Turkish languages, are very old written languages. This is true for, especially for Greek and Armenian and for Anatolia, but also, of course, for other languages throughout the empire. So they have a rich written tradition. We can assume that we have millions of sources, of documents for Ottoman history that should be included into the study of Ottoman history in general. So, to understand the history of Western Anatolia, it would distort the historiography totally if we don't include Greek sources as well, since such an important portion of the population was Greek. For the eastern part of Anatolia, also for the central part of Anatolia, let's say for Anatolia, throughout Anatolia, it would be a real loss not to include Armenian sources. And of course, we have thousands of them, we have millions of them, and we usually don't use them for Ottoman studies because we don't know the language. There is also a language barrier. But of course, Ottoman history, or our view on Ottoman history, changes profoundly if we start to include the sources and the perspectives of these sources, and write the Ottoman history as a multilingual history, which reflects the multilinguality of the Ottoman Empire and Ottoman society. So, and this would avoid, we would avoid writing the Ottoman Empire as, writing the history of the Ottoman Empire somehow as a Turkish history, because we are using only the sources, or mainly the sources, of the Ottoman State Archive, which is the sources of the Ottoman central bureaucracy, written in Ottoman Turkish, and necessarily reflecting the view and the perspective of the central government of the Ottoman Empire, which is one perspective and one possible perspective among a lot of the various possible perspectives, but not the only one. And even in the Ottoman state archives, we find a lot of documents written in the other non-Turkish Ottoman sources, and for decades and decades and decades, Ottomanists tended not to work with these sources because the non-Turkish post-Ottoman societies were not so much interested in Ottoman history, as I said, and the Turkish Ottomanists were not so much interested in the non-Turkish part of the Ottoman Empire, plus they were not necessarily able to read the language or languages. So, quite a long number of years ago, in the early 2000s, we started to think, how can we do this kind of integral Ottoman historiography? And we picked a very tiny, small topic to make this experiment of a multilingual Ottoman historiography. So, we thought, in the first Ottoman parliament, the first, not the second that came about in 1908, but the first, which was established after the proclamation of the Ottoman Constitution in 1876, and then it came into being in 1877. It had a duration of 1 year and a couple of months until it was again closed down. So in this parliament, there were Ottoman deputies from all Ottoman provinces, and of course of all Ottoman population groups. Let's try to bring all of these together and to assemble a group of Ottomanist historians. And the criteria would be to assemble as many Ottoman languages to our field and then distribute the tasks. So, the one who knows Arabic, Ottoman Turkish and Arabic should look for Arabic sources for the Ottoman deputies to the first parliament from Syria or other Arabic-speaking provinces. The one who reads Bulgarian should look at the Bulgarian sources for the Ottoman deputies, and so on, Albanian, Armenian, Greek, what have you. So, we all started to work. And I had a closer look at the Armenian deputies of the Ottoman parliament. And I thought, very simple. I look to the Turkish language sources. I look to the Armenian language sources. I know where to find them. And I will write my contributions in very short time. I went to a specialized Armenian library. I looked for necessarily Armenian sources. And what did I find? Almost nothing. There were a number of Armenian deputies in this first Ottoman parliament. And obviously these people were among the wealthiest, the most notable, the most respected personalities of their provinces. Yet, Armenian historiography did not remember them. Because they were Ottoman and Ottomanist functionaries. They were not the representatives of an Armenian national idea opposed to the Ottoman state, or besides or beyond the Ottoman state. But they were Ottomans. And as Ottomans, as Armenian Ottomans, they fell out of the Turkish scope, and as Armenian Ottomans, they fell out of the Armenian scope. So here, forgetting. And it was quite tough to somehow get all the small bits and pieces about these personalities, to try to collect as much information as I could get about these people, and to include them, to re-include them into historiography. And I could say the same thing for all the other contributions. It is an intellectual operation or a historiographical operation to look at these people and to re-include them, to rewrite them into Ottoman history and into history as such. It is a double void. It was an operation to rewrite the Armenians into the Ottoman history, but also to rewrite the Ottoman context and Ottoman identity into Armenian history. And this same operation is taking place now in recent years, like the last 20 years or so, to all post-Ottoman societies. Now we have a younger generation and we have a more pluralistic way of, we have a younger generation willing to learn more than one Ottoman language to start with, to combine. Somebody who works on Cyprus today, on Ottoman Cyprus today, necessarily learns Ottoman Turkish and Greek. And I could name all the other examples as well. So here is an ideological turning point to look at Ottoman history not from a national and nationalistic point of view, but to look at the Ottoman Empire as an empire and to look at its inhabitants and elites as Ottomans. To look at them as nationals would be anachronistic. So we have to overcome anachronistic historiography and anachronistic assumptions of the Ottomans being Turks, or the Armenians being aware of something like an Armenian nationality. That was in the beginning. And of course, in the 18th century or in the 17th century, we have Armenian sources talking about the Armenians as an Armenian people. But that does not mean that they mean an Armenian nation in the modern sense. Even at the end of the Ottoman Empire, Armenian nation building process and Turkish nation building process and all the other nation building processes was not complete, but it was, to use the terminology of Benedict Anderson again, a proto-nation or proto-nationalism. In the making, but not finished yet. So the people were Ottoman, and their framework of imagination was very much Ottoman. So Armenians in Istanbul were not feeling themselves that they are in diaspora. Even though Istanbul is thousands of kilometers away from historical Armenian highland. But since it was the Ottoman Empire, it was the center of Armenian culture in the Ottoman Empire, of Ottoman Armenian culture. So, in the last remaining minutes, I give you the cliffhanger for the next session. And so to catch up with the first sentences I said, after having talked about all of these, pre-assumptions of Ottoman history, there is the elephant in the room. And this is yet another category. Talking or not talking, remembering or forgetting or denying the genocide of the Armenians during World War I is yet another category. Because here, it's not only about forgetting of certain elites that we prefer not to remember, so we may have forgot them, but we did not eradicate them from our memory. But in the case of the Armenian genocide, of course, it is a genocide, but Turkish Republic, as it is rooted on the ethnic cleansing, the Armenian genocide, for decades until today, official Turkish political discourse is not able to acknowledge the Armenian genocide. It's not able to acknowledge the simple fact of what has occurred. So the historiography of the Armenian genocide, and thus the historiography of the late Ottoman Empire, of the last decades of the Ottoman Empire, is struggling not against forgetting, but against a very powerful policy of denialism. And denialism means actively suppressing the memory and actively, suppressing everything that leads to the memory. And this had very, very severe implications. Not only not being able to talk about the annihilation of the Ottoman Armenians, but also because Armenians were scattered throughout Anatolia, wherever you look, wherever. It's not only the so-called Armenian highland in the east, the traditional, provinces where Armenians were living, but it's also in western Turkey, in Bursa, in Thrace, where you have very important and very large Armenian communities. So if you don't want to talk about the Armenians and about the Armenian genocide, you are unable to talk about Armenian presence pre-genocide. You are unable to talk about Armenian cultural contributions, Armenian contributions to the local economy. And since the Armenians were so interwoven into Ottoman economy and politics and culture, you were not able to talk about the history of Anatolia at all. And this led to a very peculiar historiography of the Ottoman Empire, which we still see today. We have numerous studies on all Ottoman provinces, and the least studied region of the Ottoman Empire is Anatolia itself, which should be the sum of the heartland, and which should have been studied at least by Turkish historians. But if you dig, and wherever you dig, an Armenian pops out, you are not able to do that. So for decades, we had very little historiography on Anatolia proper, even not on the non-Armenian topics, but it's difficult. Now, of course, that changed again, and we have now a new corpus of study, and of course, which comes with it, we have a number of Turkish and also Kurdish scholars, historians, who learn Armenian, and vice versa. We have a number of scholars, not very big numbers, but growing numbers, let's say, of scholars in Turkey who learn Armenian, but also Armenian scholars who learn Ottoman Turkish and are able to combine, Ottoman Turkish and Turkish, and to combine the reading of Ottoman state archives and Ottoman sources in Ottoman language, including sources in Armeno-Turkish, which is Armenian script, but Ottoman Turkish language. A completely understudied, neglected corpus of sources, and also, of course, Armenian language sources. And here we are studying the history of Anatolia, which requires at least, knowing that once upon a time there were Armenians living in Anatolia and now they are not. And knowing, yes, that was a very violent act. In the next session, in January, I will talk about exactly this politics of denialism and how it shaped the historiography of the Armenian genocide, and what could be the path out and what is in recent years the path out.